Welcome to FearBound Stories. Please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now let's begin. The road into the Appalachian foothills narrowed long before my GPS lost signal. Pine and oak crowded in so tightly that midday felt like dusk, and the mountains rose around the asphalt like watching shapes, older than towns, older than names. I was driving toward an inherited property my uncle had left behind, a cabin that hadn't seen a visitor since before he died. Locals in the last town warned me not to go up the mountain after sundown, but they said it the way people say the weather's bad, casual, practiced, already resigned. I reached the gravel turnoff just as the sun slipped behind the ridgeline. The path was barely wide enough for my truck, and the forest swallowed sound so completely that even the engine felt muffled, like I was already underground. About halfway up, I noticed something strange. The woods on either side went completely still. No cicadas, no birds. Even the wind seemed to stop following me. That's when I saw the lantern. It hung from a thick iron hook nailed into a tree trunk, glowing faintly amber, swaying as if someone had just passed it. There was no house nearby, no trail marker, just that lonely light in the dark. I slowed, then stopped entirely, heart hammering. Appalachian backroads are full of old hunting signals and abandoned gear, but something about the way the lantern burned, steady, patient, felt wrong, like it was waiting for me to notice. I told myself it was nothing and kept driving. Less than a mile later, my headlights caught something standing in the road. A man, tall and thin, wearing old-fashioned work clothes, hat pulled low. He didn't move, didn't even turn his head as I rolled closer. When I stopped and asked if he needed help, he pointed silently into the trees toward where the lantern had been. His finger was crooked, bent at an unnatural angle, like it had healed wrong decades ago. Before I could say anything else, he stepped backward into the forest and vanished. The rest of the drive felt wrong. The road looped when it shouldn't have. Familiar bends repeated. Twice I passed the same broken fence. When I finally reached the cabin, the porch light was already on. I knew for a fact I hadn't turned it on. Inside, the cabin smelled like damp wood and smoke, the kind that clings permanently to walls. My uncle's things were mostly untouched, but on the kitchen table sat an old oil lantern identical to the one I'd seen on the tree. Cold, unlit. Beside it lay a notebook with one sentence repeated again and again, pressed deep into the paper like he'd been carving instead of writing. If the lantern is lit, don't follow it. If it points for you, don't look back. That night, the forest came alive. Footsteps circled the cabin, slow and deliberate, stopping just short of the porch. The lantern on the table flickered on by itself, bathing the room in amber light. Outside, something knocked 3 times on the door. Slow, evenly spaced, polite. I remembered another local warning then, half laughed off earlier that day. Don't answer knocks that sound like they're counting. The knocking moved to the windows next, each tap matching the rhythm of the lantern's sway. Through the glass, I saw shapes between the trees. Men standing too still, faces hidden, fingers bent the same way. When the lantern suddenly went dark, the knocking stopped instantly. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I left the cabin behind without locking the door, without turning back. As I descended the mountain, I passed the lantern again, hanging from the same tree. It was unlit now, blackened with soot. The iron hook rusted deep into the bark as if it had been there far longer than the forest itself. Back in the valley, I pulled over and checked my phone. It finally had service. A missed voicemail from the sheriff's office played automatically. They said the man I described had been reported missing in the 1940s. A mine collapse. Never found. Locals claimed he still guided travelers up the mountain, but only once. I never returned to claim the cabin. Sometimes, late at night, I still smell smoke and oil, and I swear I can see a faint amber glow through the trees outside my window, waiting patiently for me to follow. Before we move on to the next story, give us your verdict on this one. And don't forget to like and subscribe. The house sat at the edge of a narrow Appalachian hollow, wedged between steep slopes where mist never fully burned off and sunlight only reached for a few hours each day. And when I first saw it, the locals had already stopped calling it by its proper name, referring to it only as the one past the bent sycamore. I moved there after inheriting the place from my grandmother, who'd lived her entire life in these mountains and died without ever explaining why she refused to leave, even when the coal jobs vanished and the roads started collapsing from neglect. She warned me once years ago never to sleep in the back bedroom, but she said it casually, like advice about drafty windows or creaking floorboards, not like a warning meant to save a life. The first night in the house felt wrong long before anything happened, because the sounds outside followed patterns that didn't match the forest I knew. Insects going quiet together and then starting again in slow waves, as if something deeper was passing underneath the ground rather than walking on it. Just before midnight, I heard footsteps coming from the woods, slow and careful, stopping near the tree line where the land dipped downward behind the house. And when I looked through the window, I saw a man standing there, perfectly still, his outline barely visible through the fog rising off the creek. He didn't wave or shout, and his posture was strange, bent slightly forward, his arms angled too stiffly at his sides, as if standing upright caused him discomfort. I told myself he was lost, maybe drunk, maybe hurt, and stepped out onto the porch to ask if he needed help. The man lifted his head slowly, revealing a face that made my throat tighten because his features looked flattened, smoothed out in places, like someone had pressed clay where bones should have been. His mouth opened, but instead of forming words, he released a sound that reminded me of air being forced through a narrow tunnel. He pointed past me directly at the back bedroom window. Before I could react, the porch boards creaked behind me, footsteps answering his presence from the other side of the house. And when I turned back, the man was gone, leaving the fog drifting quietly where he'd been standing. Inside, the house felt different, heavier, and the temperature had dropped enough that my breath fogged faintly in the hallway, and every floorboard seemed to protest my movement, not with age, but with awareness. I found the door to the back bedroom standing open even though I was certain I had closed it earlier, and inside the room the air smelled of earth and cold stone, nothing like the rest of the house. The bed sat untouched, but on the floor beside it were muddy footprints leading from the window to the doorway, stopping inches from where I stood. That night I dreamed of tunnels beneath the mountain, of miners digging into something they were never meant to find, and of men crawling out of collapsed shafts with faces pressed smooth by the weight of the earth itself. In the morning, I discovered the truth spilling out slowly from the locals, who avoided eye contact when I asked about the back bedroom and crossed themselves quietly when I mentioned the man in the woods. They told me the mountain was hollowed wrong decades ago, mined deeper than it should have been, and that something down there never stayed buried when disturbed. They said the bedroom sits directly above the oldest shaft, the one they sealed after the cave-in that killed 6 men and disfigured the survivors so badly none of them were ever seen again. That night, the footsteps returned, circling closer than before, stopping directly beneath the window. And when I finally gathered the courage to look outside, I saw multiple figures now, their shapes cramped and unnatural, pointing upward together, silently insisting I join them below. I left the house before dawn, abandoning it to the mountain. But sometimes when I'm driving through Appalachian roads late at night, I feel pressure in my ears like descending underground, and I swear, I can hear footsteps beneath the pavement, matching my speed, waiting for me to come back home. Before we move on to the next story, give us your verdict on this one. And don't forget to like and subscribe. The road that led into the upper Appalachian Ridge wasn't marked on my GPS anymore, not after the last storm washed part of it away. And the only reason I took it at all was because the locals told me it was the fastest way to reach the fire lookout tower my cousin had volunteered to restore before he disappeared. They spoke his name carefully in town, lowering their voices when they mentioned the mountain. And one old man at the gas station told me I should turn around before the fog settled, because the ridge didn't like visitors once the light faded. I assumed it was superstition mixed with grief, the kind that grows when accidents don't leave bodies behind. By the time I reached the tree line, the fog had already thickened, rolling over the road in slow sheets, clinging to the pines so tightly that even the sound of my tires felt muted, and the forest grew unnaturally quiet in a way that felt deliberate rather than peaceful. I parked near the base of the old fire tower just before dusk, surprised to find the gate unlocked, even though the place was officially closed. And as I stepped out of the car, I noticed scrapings on the dirt as if something heavy had been dragged repeatedly toward the structure. The tower itself rose above the trees on rusted metal legs, its stairs creaking under every step as I climbed. And halfway up, I noticed scratches carved into the paint, deep and uneven, looping around each support beam as though someone had gripped them tightly while being pulled downward. At the top platform, my cousin's backpack still leaned against the railing, stiff with rain and dirt, and inside it were supplies he would never have left behind willingly, including his radio, which crackled faintly even when powered off, bleeding in indistinct voices through the static. As darkness settled fully, lights began appearing in the valley below, not houses or vehicles, but small moving glows drifting slowly between the trees, rising and falling in uneven patterns like lanterns carried by unseen hands. The radio suddenly clicked on by itself, and through the hiss of interference I heard my cousin's voice speaking calmly, saying he had found something beneath the tower, something that needed help finding its way back up. His tone was strained, stretched thin, as if his breath had to travel a long distance before reaching the microphone. I shouted into the radio demanding to know where he was, but the reply came from behind me instead, spoken softly near the stairs, repeating my name exactly the way my cousin used to when he wanted my attention. When I turned, the fog had climbed the tower, filling the staircase below with a thick white mass that crept upward step by step. And within it, I saw shapes pressing outward, faces widening and narrowing like reflections on warped glass. One figure emerged briefly into view, its body bent too sharply at the spine, its limbs folded at wrong angles as if built for crawling rather than standing. And when it raised its head, I recognized my cousin's jacket hanging loosely over shoulders that no longer fit human form. The radio dropped to the floor and shattered, releasing a final burst of static followed by silence, so complete my ears rang from it. And from below the tower came the sound of metal groaning as though the structure itself was being pulled downward into the mountain. I fled the tower without looking back, sliding down the stairs as shadows climbed after me. And when I reached my car, the headlights illuminated dozens of footprints surrounding it, all facing inward, all pressed deep into the dirt like something heavy had stood there waiting. At dawn, rescue teams arrived after my frantic call made it through, but the tower was already leaning slightly, its base destabilized, and they told me the mountain beneath it was riddled with old collapses that had never been properly sealed. Officially, my cousin's disappearance was blamed on structural failure and poor visibility. But locals still avoid that ridge, because at night, they claim lights wander upward through the trees toward places no one should be climbing anymore. Sometimes, when I drive through Appalachia after dark and lose signal near high ground, my radio hisses softly, and I hear a familiar voice asking for help from somewhere below the road, reminding me that the mountains remember everyone who digs too deep or climbs too high. Before we move on to the next story, give us your verdict on this one. And don't forget to like and subscribe. The bridge wasn't on my map, even though the road leading to it clearly was, and that should have been my first sign to turn back. But in Appalachia, there are stretches of pavement that don't bother explaining themselves. Roads laid down before records were kept properly, before anyone thought to question why a place existed in the first place. I was driving back from a late shift at the county hospital when my GPS lost signal and rerouted me through a narrow mountain road I had never taken before. A road that climbed steadily into thicker forest, the trees pressing so close to my headlights that the world ahead felt like a tunnel rather than an open landscape. That's when I saw the bridge, a long wooden span stretching across a gorge I couldn't see the bottom of. Its planks dark with moisture, and its railings worn smooth as if countless hands had dragged along them over generations. And hanging at the entrance was a hand-painted sign with peeling letters that read, "One at a time." I slowed instinctively, noticing that my headlights did not reflect properly off the wood, the beams seeming to sink into the surface rather than bounce back. And as I crept forward, my radio faded into static, cutting out entirely the moment my tires touched the first plank. Halfway across, something felt wrong about the distance behind me, the stretch of bridge appearing far longer in my rearview mirror than it had before. And when I glanced ahead, the far end looked just as distant, as though the bridge had lengthened once I committed to crossing. I rolled my window down slightly, expecting to hear creek water or wind rushing below. But instead there was silence so complete it made my ears ring. And within that silence came the faint sound of footsteps on wood, not matching my car's movement, but following in a slow, deliberate rhythm. I told myself it was the bridge shifting under the weight of the vehicle, but the footsteps did not stop when I stopped, and when I turned off the engine entirely, the sound continued, circling the car from a distance I could not judge. Then I saw shapes moving along the railing ahead, hands gripping the wood from the far side, pale fingers curling over worn planks one by one, pulling bodies upward that seemed reluctant to leave whatever waited below the bridge. My headlights flickered, and in the flashing light I caught glimpses of faces rising just high enough to be seen, flattened and swollen, eyes open but unfocused, mouths hanging slack as if speech had been left somewhere underwater. I remembered an old story my grandfather used to tell when I was a kid, about holler bridges built over sinkholes or deep cuts where miners dumped the unclaimed dead, places the river refused to wash clean no matter how many years passed. The footsteps rushed then, no longer patient, slamming against the planks from beneath the car, and the entire bridge groaned like it was remembering every weight it had ever carried. I turned the key and floored the accelerator, the tires skidding uselessly on wet wood for a terrifying second before catching just enough for the car to lurch forward, the sound of splintering boards following me like a scream held underwater. The moment my tires hit solid ground, the radio snapped back to life at full volume, a local emergency broadcast warning drivers to avoid an old crossing that had collapsed decades ago and taken several miners with it during a flood. When I looked in my rearview mirror, the bridge was gone, replaced by a narrow strip of intact road and forest. No gorge, no railing, no sign anywhere that a crossing had ever existed. The next morning I searched county records and learned that the bridge had been washed out 50 years earlier, officially sealed off after multiple reports of drivers claiming the span lengthened beneath them, and voices followed their vehicles across. Even now, I avoid mountain detours at night, because sometimes when the fog hangs low and the radio cuts to static, I can still hear slow footsteps on wood, waiting patiently for someone else to cross alone. Before we move on to the next story, give us your verdict on this one. And don't forget to like and subscribe. The road into the mountain cemetery hadn't been used in years, not officially, but locals still drove it when daylight and courage aligned, and the only reason I was there at all was because my family insisted we bury my uncle beside the rest of our blood, where generations had already been laid to rest on a slope that never quite stopped shifting. Appalachian graveyards are different from others, scattered across hillsides rather than laid flat, headstones tilting at uneven angles as the earth slowly reclaims them. And as I parked near the rusted gate just before dusk, I noticed how many markers were sunken so deep their names were barely visible, swallowed inch by the mountain. The service ended quickly, as these things tend to do when night approaches faster than planned, and as people drifted back toward their cars, an older woman caught my arm and told me not to linger once the light dipped behind the ridge, saying the dead up there didn't like being watched after dark. I laughed it off politely and waited until the others were gone, wanting a moment alone to settle my thoughts. But when the first shadow stretched unnaturally long across the graves, the temperature dropped sharply, and the quiet became oppressive in a way that pressed against my chest. That was when I heard the bell. It was faint at first, a dull metallic sound echoing from somewhere deep downslope, rising slowly as if carried uphill by unseen hands. And when I followed it with my eyes, I saw a small lantern flickering between the headstones, drifting closer without being carried by anyone I could see. In Appalachia, lanterns were once used to guide mourners home after night burials, but they were also used for something else, though no one liked to explain that part in detail, only muttering about ways to keep the dead from forgetting where they belonged. The lantern stopped 3 rows away, its light revealing a headstone that hadn't been there earlier, freshly carved, dirt still clinging to its base, and engraved into the stone was my full name, etched with unsettling precision down to the middle initial my family rarely used. My breath caught as the ground near the stone shifted slightly, soil settling as though something beneath it had rolled over, and from the surrounding darkness came whispers, soft and overlapping. Voices speaking names not aloud but directly into my thoughts, calling people back who had once been buried there and never left properly. I tried to step away, but the slope beneath my feet gave just enough to send pebbles rolling downhill, and immediately the bell rang again, louder this time, impatient, as shadows began gathering near the lantern, taller and heavier than the people who cast them. The mountain itself seemed to inhale as the lantern's flame brightened, revealing figures rising slightly from the earth, not fully formed, their bodies still bound to the ground as if the soil refused to let go completely. Fingers emerging first, then shoulders. Faces pressed smooth by decades of weight above them. I remembered something my grandfather once told me late one night, his voice low and serious as he warned that in these mountains, graves weren't always doors in only one direction, and that some spirits waited not to escape, but to be replaced. The bell rang a final time directly behind me. I didn't turn around. I ran down the path, ignoring the way the ground tugged at my shoes, ignoring the whispers urging me to rest, promising the mountain would remember me kindly if I stayed. And when I reached my car, the lantern's glow lingered just beyond the tree line, lingering like a patient eye watching me leave. At dawn, curiosity dragged me back to daylight sanity, and when I returned later that morning, the cemetery looked unchanged, quiet, peaceful, the lantern gone, the ground still, and no trace of a gravestone bearing my name anywhere on the hillside. But every time I visit Appalachia now, I check cemeteries by instinct, scanning the rows carefully, because sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I catch the faint glimmer of a lantern waiting beside a stone that hasn't sunk yet, patiently marking a place the mountain believes already belongs to me. You've just crossed the boundary between reality and the unknown. If you felt the fear tonight, Make sure to subscribe before you leave, because on this channel every story is just the beginning. New nightmares arrive every few nights, each one darker than the last. Until then, keep your lights low, your doors locked, and your mind open. You are now part of the FearBound family.